Greetings, dear viewers. We're happy to welcome you on ALLATRA TV. My name is Marina, and my co-hosts today are Anastasia, Olga, and Alex. Today, we're interviewing a very interesting guest, Laird Scranton. Laird is an independent researcher of ancient cosmology and language and author of numerous books. His studies in comparative cosmology have helped to synchronize aspects of ancient African, Egyptian, Vedic, Chinese, Polynesian, and other world cosmologies, and have led to an alternative approach to reading Egyptian hieroglyphic world. And today, we're happy to talk to Laird about his research and its meaning for our society. Laird, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I've been looking forward to this all week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining. And you're doing a really important work. And you have such a unique approach to studying ancient cultures and ancient knowledge. And we wanted to ask you, what brought you to this area of research and what inspires you and motivates in what you do? And can you please share that?
Yes. In the mid to late 1990s, I learned about the Dogon tribe through a chapter in a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark. The Dogon knew some things about science that they shouldn't know. The Dogon are a modern-day primitive African tribe who have no access to technology as we know it. They live in a desert land distant from anything we consider technological. They are farmers and artists and priests, a very priestly tradition. I saw an opportunity with Dogon culture because as I learned more about them, I realized that the Dogon culture includes elements from at least three major ancient traditions. They have civic practices like ancient Egypt at around 3000 BC. They have rituals that are similar to Judaism at about 3000 BC. And they have a symbolic creation tradition, a symbolic cosmology that is similar to Buddhism's at around that same era. And I thought I saw an opportunity to learn more about those three traditions and to trace original meanings and possible information about an original source for those three traditions by focusing study on the Dogon. Now, the next aspect of the Dogon that was important to me was the Dogon priests say that their symbolic system describes how matter forms. And I could see that they correctly described atoms. They correctly understood the definition of electrons and protons and neutrons. And they correctly diagrammed the shape of an electron orbital path. So the system looked scientific to me, and I wondered whether the detailed descriptions they give of more descending stages of matter that are more essential than electrons and protons and neutrons, whether those descending stages might also be correct in scientific terms, and whether we might be able to learn something from that. Anyone who could have been talking about the structure of matter at 3000 BC might know quite a bit more than we do about the structure of matter. So my main motivation in doing comparative studies was to learn more about that. I quickly realized that all of the major classic religious traditions or symbolic traditions seem to derive from a common source. They all understand their symbols in the same way. They all understand similar terms. They use similar metaphors to represent ideas. And so I started writing a series of books that moved geographically from Northern Africa, where the Dogon live, to Egypt, to India, to Tibet and China, then to ancient Turkey, then on to northern Scotland, which surprised even me that there would be a leap of that distance to northern Scotland at around 3600 BC, down into the United Kingdom, and then on to Polynesia to the Maori in New Zealand at around 1600 AD. All of these groups show evidence of influence by the same symbolic tradition. And each group that I study provided me with a new perspective, a fresh perspective on the same set of ideas. The symbols that the Dogon define are from the same set of symbols as Jung's archetypes. These are themes and symbols and mythical concepts that survive all around the globe, even among cultures that are widely distant from each other, that are not thought to have had any direct contact with each other. So those were my primary motivations, were the opportunities to understand more about ancient symbolism and to understand more about the science of creation.
Thank you very much for your answer. Very interesting. And I know Olga has the question for you too. Olga, could you please turn on your microphone?
And could you please tell us why this information that time was transmitted using symbols and myths? What was the reason for it?
Your question is why they were used in symbols and myths? First, we need to understand about language, that any communication that happens without the use of spoken words is symbolic communication. In the ancient system, spoken language is an icon of materiality, of a material domain. The system of cosmology that I'm exploring begins with the philosophy called Samkhya in India. And Samkhya is a companion to yoga. People are probably more familiar with yoga. Samkhya is the cosmological representation. Yoga is the personal and biological representation of the same set of concepts. Samkhya says that universes form in pairs, one of them non-material and one of them material. Spoken language is associated with materiality, not with non-materiality. And so any communication that involves non-materiality comes in the form of symbols because there is no spoken language. From our perspective, working with the symbolic system that cultures have had since around 10,000 BC, a symbol is a very effective way to represent a concept, a single concept. For example, originally the idea was to associate concepts with animals and elements in the everyday surroundings of a person. And so the quivering of a rabbit was associated with the concept of vibration of matter. And the slithering motion of a serpent was associated with the motion of energy, the cyclical motion of energy. A symbol is an excellent way to represent a single concept, but it's not a very good way to represent a process. And so once concepts have been defined, the teachers of this tradition wanted to use those concepts to explain processes. And a good way to do that is to write a storyline, a myth. And in that myth, originally, each of the characters represented one of these concepts or one of the dynamics of creation. And we can tell from the name of the character which concept or which dynamic the character represents. As an example, in the Dogon creation myths, there is a character named Ogo, O-G-O.
Mm-hmm.
Ogo corresponds to an Egyptian god named Aku, A-A-K-H-U, who is the god of light. The word Aku in Egypt represents the concept of light. The actions of Ogo in the Dogon myth are the actions of light. And so the storyline that they're telling within that kind of a myth, that kind of cosmological myth, is illustrating dynamics. It's illustrating a process for us. Here's how a process happens. Watch what the characters do and you'll understand how the process happens. In one Dogon myth, there are descriptions of a creator god named Amma. We can tell from Amma's name that Amma is not really a deity. Amma represents a concept. Means to know. And in a biblical sense, the concept of knowing implies biological reproduction, recreation. Ma means to perceive. When we're talking about the formation of matter, an act of perception is a key occurrence. We know that when we're watching interactions in the quantum domain, that as soon as we perceive a quantum element, its wave-like behavior is transformed into particle-like behavior mysteriously, almost magically. There's what happens is called the collapse of wave function. It's the act of perception that initiates that. So Amma's name tells us that Amma represents the concept of these initiating actions of creation. The movements of Amma and Ogo in this creation myth are the motions of virtual particles in science. What Amma and Ogo do describe for us what happens at the level of virtual particles in science. Virtual particles are fluctuations of energy that persistently occur in the background energy of the universe. You can compare these to ripples that appear on the surface of water. They appear and they dissipate, and they appear and they dissipate. There's nothing we can do to cause it or to stop it. Anywhere you look on the surface of water, even when there's no obvious wind or obvious cause, we see ripples happen. The same thing is true with energy. So myths are a better way of preserving or of relaying that kind of information. Now, another function of myth in ancient times relates to the concept of unity to multiplicity. This is a theme of ancient creation traditions, the idea that non-materiality is associated with the concept of unity, and that materiality is associated with the concept of multiplicity or multiple things, and that there's a dynamic between non-materiality and materiality of unity to multiplicity. The simplest example to give you of that is the transformation of white light through a crystal into the 7 colors of a rainbow. It's that dynamic. The same dynamic happens with sound, where a single tone can come to be represented as 7 musical notes. anytime we see that dynamic, a 1 to 7 or a 1 to 8 in total relationship, it implies that something has crossed this boundary between non-materiality and materiality. Now, the same effect happens with the meanings of ancient words in the cosmological traditions I work with. Every cosmological term carries not just a single meaning, but it carries a cluster of meanings. And the meanings are as different from each other as the colors of the rainbow are from each other. The situation is that knowing one meaning in a cluster will not reasonably allow a person to guess the secondary meanings of that cluster. And those clusters hold true across the boundaries of cultures that have similar languages, but they also hold true across the boundaries of languages of cultures that have different languages. The cluster associates with the concepts, not with the phonetics. So I can look at the Dogon language, which is phonetically often very different from Sanskrit, but find the same clusters of meanings expressed by a single phonetic value in the Dogon language, expressed by a different phonetic value in Sanskrit, but the same cluster of meanings. And those clusters allow me to positively correlate words between cultures outside of the auspices of traditional linguistics. I'm not tracing an etymology from one culture to the other. I'm not saying the second culture received the word from the first culture. I'm saying they both preserve the same word, and we know it's the same word because we can see the same cluster of meanings associated with it. That cluster provides us with multiple points of evidence on which to argue this is the same word.
Wow, that's very interesting, Laird. So essentially, how this system was set up, that for physical objects, they kind of had certain symbols, but for the concepts and process, they were transferring that as the myths, right?
Yes. Now, they were also, in places like ancient Egypt, myths were also used to preserve these clusters of meanings. We have myths about mythical emperors of China who were the bringers of civilizing skills. And in these myths are formulated in a particular way. The myth involves the emperor himself, who has a name that rests on a phonetic value. And then the myth describes to us where such things as where the emperor was born, places he lived, accomplishments he made, major events in his career, civilizing skills he was associated with, and so on. When we examine those meanings against an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, we discover that they reflect the same cluster of meanings of a single phonetic value, and the phonetic value is the name of the emperor. So the myth is there not to describe a process, but to preserve the coherent definition of this cluster of meanings. Perhaps that's because life in ancient China was not as stable as it was in places like ancient Egypt. And so these clusters of meanings, which would normally be preserved by a priest in the context of a village, may have had to be preserved in this coded form in public and passed along as a public story that no one knew the actual meaning of, the underlying meaning of. And so they managed to preserve esoteric knowledge in a public way rather than a private way.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And I would like to come back to what you said earlier about etymology of word ama, because it drew my attention. I was reading yesterday about concept of mo, or later ma, in Sumerian culture, as well as the special power of ma or man in island of Eastern Island. So in their legend, they say that people use this power and who were able to control it. They were able to not only move this big statue that we have in the island even now, but also we're able to control the universe. Is it the same Ma than in Dogon meaning?
Yes, it's the same Ma. This is difficult to explain. From the Buddhist perspective, one of the primary attributes of the material domain is a quality called Mahat, M-A-H-A-T. Now, Mahat is the ability of a thing to take on the properties of something else, of another thing. An example they use is that if we set a crystal very near a red object, the crystal can appear to be red. It can take on the attribute of looking red, even though it doesn't have that attribute itself. The crystal is not red, but it looks to us as if it is red. And the property that allows that to happen is Mahat or Mat. Now, in ancient Egypt, Mat is a complicated concept that's not fully understood by the Egyptologists. They describe it in a variety of ways. Mat is treated as a principle of truth or justice, and it's a concept that underlies, it's an underlying principle of Egyptian society. It's an ideal that was, they were striving to attain in Egyptian society, was the attainment of Mat. And I think what they meant by that was they wanted to correctly reflect the principles and ethics and ideas and capabilities of the non-material domain, the same way that matter is said to reflect attributes of non-materiality. The Dogon perspective and the perspective of Samkhya is very similar to that of Plato, that the reality that we live in, the reality that we perceive, is a reflected image. The Dogon say that it is a correct reflected image of a more fundamental reality that exists in the form of waves. We can understand this by thinking of the idea of a television episode. The television episode looks as if it resides in our television set. We watch it on our television screen, but there's nothing that actually exists in the television set. All that we're seeing is a translated image of something that exists as digits or exists as broadcast waves that really resides someplace far distant from us. It doesn't originate with us, it originates someplace else. Well, that's the outlook that the Dogon are presenting, is that everything essential to our life and to our material experience, the seeds of all of that actually persist non-materially, not materially. And so the outlook on particles of matter is that a particle of matter is a subdivision of this grand wave-like source of energy that produces matter. However, it's the same grand wave-like source that is the source of consciousness. So individual consciousness in the same way can be understood as an individualized subset of a grand source of consciousness. In esoteric Buddhism, one of the final stages of enlightenment is coming to grasp that it's all one consciousness, that we're not talking about separate consciousnesses, that it's all one consciousness. So this concept of Mat pertains to energy as well as to consciousness and to matter and so forth. It pertains to root energies that cause material structures to form. And so if we were a culture that had control of that aspect of Mat, of that concept of Mat, the concepts of energy that underlie that Mat, that theoretically we would be able to control how structures move and how structures form and how mass and weight and other attributes of physics take place. So that's how they relate. It's a complicated perspective, but I can tell you that there's a scientifically reasonable path to get from the root energies of two universes that cause the universes to differentiate, all the way to the table our computer is sitting on. This is a single set of dynamics of energy that repeat in parallel form on all upward scales of creation, from the quantum scale all the way up to the macrocosm. If you can understand how those dynamics of energy work on any of those scales, you can infer how they must work on the other scales. And so that's why it's important. The Hermetic principle is important. As above, so below. They're talking about parallelism of function. Once we understand that there is parallelism, that's hugely beneficial to us in terms of understanding how things we can't see work. We don't have to look at it to understand how it works. If we know the dynamics of water, we know the dynamics of energy. It's the same dynamics. The dynamics of a spinning vortex of a whirlpool of water are indistinguishable from the dynamics of a black hole. Those are indistinguishable from a tiny spiral of matter that the Dogon say exists at every point in space and time. Parallelism is a huge key to understanding these things.
Amazing information. Thank you so much for sharing it right now. Now all our viewers will be able to understand why it is so important to study ancient myth and tradition and religion. So you definitely can find the fundamental physics in it. And unfortunately, it's far advanced that we have it right now. So we definitely need as a society to invest our time and our resources in study of this field. Thank you so much, Laird, for sharing it with us.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to. This is information that is properly belongs to no one. It properly belongs to everyone. It doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone. The same way that if we find a seed on the ground, we should properly expect that we can pick it up, plant it, water it, care for it, and have it grow into a plant. This is basic human right. This was intended for everyone, not for someone. It's not proprietary information.
Absolutely. This information should be open for everyone.
Right.
It's definitely.
You know, like when I was looking at these images you sent for the Egyptian words, like I think guys all also looked at them. You know, I had an idea, just it is a kind of like they have pretty good descriptive language for certain meanings. And did you try to apply this knowledge to decode the technical knowledge Egyptians has? Because I'm explaining situation, so you know, like we in every program which we create, we highlight the aspect of the technological development, and we talk that previous civilizations did have certain technologies which are far more advanced than ours, and that it's really important to study them. And for example, if we go to the ancient Egypt, we can see such things like a light bulb, and it is obvious that they are light bulbs essentially. But what is going on is that then Russian archaeologists look at this. For example, it's in Hathor temple, there is certain Egyptian like language signs. And then they say the translation we are getting from essentially from the translators, it doesn't really tell that it is a technical device. And they say it's really not the truth. And that, did you really try to decode the technical knowledge? Because I really see a lot of applicability, your knowledge, to that side of things.
Anytime there's a concept I don't understand, in an ancient concept I don't understand, I begin by looking at the Egyptian dictionary to see what the words tell me about the concept. And then, having formed an idea from that, what the idea represents, I then test that against what did the Buddhists think about it, what did the Kabbalists think about it, what did the Dogon think about it, what do Maori words tell us about it, and so forth. So often it is a starting point, and it is absolutely technical and scientific. I have not specifically explored, not specifically deliberately explored technical meanings, but I'm happy to research questions for people. If there's a particular concept you think the Egyptians might have known about, feel free to ask me to research it. Sometimes the trick is finding the right way to represent the idea, because the way it's expressed in one language isn't always the way it's expressed in another language. If I look up the word rabbit in the Egyptian dictionary, I find no references. If I look up hare, I do. So you have to be persistent about trying to find the right expression for the word.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we would like really to switch to the new, to this topic. We already started discussion about Dogons. And, I think for our viewers, it would be super valuable if you would introduce who essentially were Dogons. But before, let's watch a short video which we prepared about Dogons.
Could you say that again? I missed the last part of your sentence.
We will watch the short video about Dogons first.
Yes.
So, Laird, could you please, for our viewers, to make the introduction to who essentially who are Dogons and why their knowledge is important for us?
The Dogon are a priestly tribe. They are a modern-day African tribe who live in Mali, the country of Mali, which is located in the northwest hump of Africa. The Dogon are a modern-day primitive tribe. They see it as their cultural responsibility to preserve original forms and meanings of language, of symbols, of ritual practices. And so they make an excellent entry point for exploration of concepts of the kind that I've been researching. They deliberately located themselves around 1500 AD. They deliberately moved a great distance away from the Niger River. They now live in southwest Mali, about an 8-hour trip by car across the desert. They live alongside cliffs in small villages. There are about 300,000 Dogon tribes people. Any Dogon tribes person who's interested can become initiated in their symbolic tradition. but it's the responsibility of the tribesperson to pursue it. The way the tradition works, the student is responsible for asking the next question that advances their own knowledge. And their teacher, their informant, hears the question, considers whether it's an appropriate question to what the student already knows. If it's appropriate, the teacher is required to answer truthfully. If not, the teacher is required to remain silent, or if necessary, they can lie. They can fib. They can tell a lie to protect inner secrets of the tradition. If the student insists on an answer that the informant doesn't want to give. That dynamic is not restricted to the Dogon tribe. Any person who is in contact with a Dogon priest who wants to learn about the tradition potentially can. A famous French anthropologist named Marcel Griaule, who studied the Dogon for 30 years, was initiated in the Dogon tradition. He was granted Dogon citizenship, and he was eventually given a Dogon burial when he died in 1956. It's his studies that are a primary source of my work. It looks as if the Dogon were beneficial. Okay, let me back up. We can see two major rounds of instruction in the symbolic tradition. One occurred around 10,000 BC, and another occurred around 3200 BC. It looks as if the Dogon were the group that did the best job of preserving the original instruction. And so during the second round of instruction, Dogon priests seem to have been utilized as assistant professors. They were the ones who interacted with the students based on Scandinavian descriptions on Orkney Island in Scotland. It looks as if Dogon priests were instrumental in the teaching of other initiates during the era of 3200 BC.
So were they physically there, or how this is happening? Just do you have more information on that?
The instruction physically given?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. What the Dogon describe is they describe a concern of their teachers. Again, I should back up. We have two parallel systems of symbols, one preserved in Buddhism in Sanskrit, and one preserved by the Dogon in the Dogon language. The Dogon language is technically unclassifiable because it includes 18 subsets of words from other languages that the Dogon are very careful to keep separate and discrete. Many of the Dogon cosmological words are ancient Egyptian words. Now, these two traditions are so closely matched that in the modern day, if you ask an expert on Buddhist symbolism about the meaning of a symbol or the meaning of a concept or a tradition, the Buddhist expert understands it in the same way that Marcel Griaule understood it for the Dogon. What that means, because these two traditions were preserved in different languages, each tradition has its own claim to being ancient. The Buddhist tradition was documented around 400 BC, and the Dogon words, the Egyptian words, went out of use around 700 BC. So these are both ancient traditions that seem to have independently managed to keep the symbolism straight for thousands of years down to the present day. And we know that the meanings didn't change because the experts in the modern day are in agreement about what the meanings are. Now, the problem for a researcher like me is that the Buddhists flatly claim that their most sacred symbols were gifted to humanity by a non-human source. The Dogon say they were non-human, their teachers were non-human, but they go a step further. The Dogon say not only were they not human, they were also originally not material. They were non-material. The Dogon perspective is that a group of knowledgeable teachers were able to take material form and conduct education classes physically, materially with humanity in the material realm. This is not psychic connection. This is not divination. This is not paranormal contact. This is real physical world contact. Now, the Dogons say that their teachers were concerned. They had a major concern. The concern was about the potentially bad effects that could happen to us if we had, because of the contact we would have with them. They weren't certain what the effects were going to be of contact with beings of originally of spirit and light on physical beings. And so to limit that, the teachers made the choice to only teach 8 tribes people from a given tribe at a time. They would take those 8 tribes people away to a remote location, instruct those 8 people in the details of a civilizing plan for humanity that gave structure to society, that was closely tagged to the symbolic creation tradition. Closely interwoven so that acts that they would take in their daily life or structures of their village or the way they plowed a field or the way they wove a cloth would reinforce the meaning of cosmological concepts they had been taught. So virtually everything about Dogon culture or about ancient Egyptian culture has symbolic meaning, down to things that we might not guess have symbolic meaning. I never guessed that a Torah scroll in Judaism was a symbol for something. I never guessed that the process that's carried out between an initiate and a Dogon priest is symbolic of something, but it is. So in the Dogon tradition, their teachers were called Numo. That's the Dogon word. The Egyptian corresponding word is actually a phrase. It's Nu-ma. Nu is a term that refers to waves or water, and ma is the word we talked about earlier. It represents the act of perception. So the name Nu-ma means literally waves perceived. In other words, the Egyptian word is repeating for us what the Dogon say is true, that wave-like beings who existed non-materially suddenly made themselves perceptible to us and were able to take action physically. The Dogon talk about a concept called the sacrifice of the Numo. And the sacrifice of the Numo is that this group of teachers chose to cross over between non-materiality and materiality, knowing that they would not be able to go back. In other words, they would be consigned for the remainder of their lives to live in the material domain, not in the non-material domain. And the Dogon saw that as a sacrifice. Now, to try to explain to you how that could happen, we have to start with the dynamics of the 2 universes. The Dogons say that there is a cycle of energy between the non-material and material universe that they compare to the natural water cycle on Earth. The natural water cycle is the cycle in which water evaporates from bodies of water like the ocean, forms clouds that rise up over the mountaintops, and produce rain that flows back to the sea. Without that cycle of water, there would be no life on the planet. The Dogon say, without the cycle of energy between the universes, there would be no life in the universe. That cycle of energy involves not just energy, it also involves mass. And so there's a persistent shifting of mass from one universe to the other universe out to a certain extent. And then the process reverses and the mass shifts back. And this is a perpetual cycle, an oscillation back and forth of energy. Einstein tells us that when mass increases, the rate of time slows down. This is a consequence of his famous formula, E equals mc squared. It's the idea that no matter how fast we travel, we will never catch up with the speed of light. The speed of light will always be measured at a constant ahead of us, no matter how fast we travel. So from the Dogon perspective, the essential difference between non-materiality and materiality is how quickly or how slowly time runs. We can think of that transfer of mass and that shifting of time frame in relation to the concept of an hourglass, where we begin with sand in the top globe of the hourglass, and it sifts through the middle, through a kind of a gateway down into the lower globe of the hourglass, until eventually all of the sand is in the lower part of the hourglass. Well, we understand that at the midpoint of that cycle, we have the same amount of sand in the top globe as we have in the bottom globe, which for the universes means at the midpoint of the cycle, we have the same rate of time on both sides of the equation. Non-materiality experiences time at the same rate we do. And it's at that point in the half cycle of this energy that it becomes theoretically possible to cross over from non-materiality to materiality without an obstacle, without resistance. We can think of that the same way we think of water pressure. You can think of the effect as being like water pressure. The difference in time frame is like a difference in water pressure. So if I am in a submarine and I go very deep in the ocean where the pressure is very great, it's not safe for me to try to move from inside the submarine outside the submarine because of the difference in pressure. I can make it possible by stepping into an airlock and equalizing the pressure inside the airlock with the pressure outside the airlock, and then I can move outside. The same thing is true with a spaceship. With an airlock, we can equalize the pressure between the domain we want to cross into, and when we equalize that pressure, it becomes safe to move from one to the other. That's what the Dogons say happened with their teachers midway through the last half cycle of this energy cycle. We, right now, from my perspective, have just passed the bottom of that half cycle. It's a 13,000 year cycle, a little over 12,000 year cycle. So roughly 6,000 years ago would have been the midpoint in that cycle. That's the same era when we see the beginning of the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar seems to mark where the midpoint of that cycle was. Now, if we think of that energy cycle, if we compare it to the cycle of a normal year, the midpoint of the cycle corresponds to the equinox of a seasonal year for us. And the point we're at right now is the equivalent of the winter solstice. It's because of the importance of these 2 points in the cycle, the midpoint where it's possible to cross over, and the solstices where we're the furthest distance from each other, that those points in an annual year were celebrated by ancient cultures for holidays, for special observances. In Judaism, let me back up. In Egypt, the word for equinox was Kepper. Kepper was the dung beetle, and Kepper's symbolism is the concept of non-existence coming into existence, precisely what the energetics are saying. In Judaism, at the equinox, they celebrate Passover. They use the word Passover, which is precisely the effect I say becomes possible. At the end of a Passover Seder finishes with the opening of a door to the outside of the room where the Seder is held to allow a non-material entity named Eliyahu to enter the room, to imaginarily enter the room. And so the participants in the Seder imagine that Eliyahu is entering the room.
Is it the moment then they celebrate this Tom Kippur, the Jewish holiday?
Yom Kippur is the other.
Yom Kippur.
Yeah, Yom Kippur, right, which we can imagine as being Yom Kippur. Yom means day. So the other equinox is the day of Kippur, from my point of view.
Interesting.
Okay, so this is what's going on with that cycle.
And Laird, and I have a question regarding this. And was it like during a specific time when these teachers came to transfer the knowledge you're talking about, and maybe there are some artifacts that point to the fact of this knowledge transfer that has occurred in the past?
Yes. Because of the way the energetics work, because of the Hebrew calendar, and because of a number of other points of evidence, it looks as if the era of instruction the Dogon are talking about, when their Numo teachers arrived here to instruct different societal groups in humanity, that era was the era of Orkney Island in Scotland. It was 3200 BC, roughly. The era begins around 3600 BC. We see what looks like instruction on Orkney happening around 3200 BC. The first evidence of this instruction is the series of megalithic sites on Orkney Island that still exist today. These are the earliest megalithic sites in the United Kingdom. They precede ancient Egypt by several hundred years. The series of sites were built over a period of 600 years, and they were connected in ancient times by a road that led to the first farming village in the United Kingdom called Skara Brae on Orkney Island, which was a village of a cluster of seven or eight chambers of houses or buildings that were set on the island. They were covered over and protected because they were covered over for thousands of years, and then accidentally uncovered around 1850 by some storms, and a very well-preserved site. Now, to the eyes of someone like me, when I see the sequence of megalithic sites on Orkney, they begin with a single standing stone called the Watchstone. Tradition has it that originally there was a second standing stone, like the Watchstone. The first standing stone corresponds to the idea of a geometric point. The second standing stone defines a second point, and together with the first point defines a linear dimension, a single line, a geometric line. The next shape is a stone circle that defines the concept of an area, a geometric area. The next shape is a burial chamber or a mound called Maze How that defines the concept of a volume in the shape of a hemisphere, which is actually the shape of the Egyptian glyph that represents mass or matter. In science, when they try to describe how matter forms, a hemisphere represents the first discrete unit of matter or of mass. The road then leads on and terminates at the Skara Brae village, which is the cluster of the 8 chambers. Those 8 chambers correspond to the next phase of creation the Dogon described for matter, which involves a cluster of 8 dimensions. So actually 7 dimensions with an 8 conceptual stage. In other words, someone lay at 3200 BC, someone set out in stone on Orkney Island in correct sequence what I understand to be an alphabet of the stages of matter of creation. If they had instead set out the letters, first 5 or 6 letters of the Russian alphabet or the first 5 or 6 letters of the English alphabet, anyone familiar with those languages would immediately recognize that someone was trying to represent the letters of the alphabet here. That's what I saw on Orkney when I first learned about these sites. Someone was describing, someone had set out deliberately on a human scale the initial stages of creation of matter in correct sequence. In other words, someone was instructing someone else in these concepts, likely on Orkney Island. The only purpose I can think of for doing that would be for the purposes of instruction. We might remember back in the 1990s, there were traveling shows that would come through shopping malls where they had inflatable structures that represented the organs of the body, and a child could walk through the heart and walk through the lungs and walk through the organs of the body and learn about biology from this mall presentation. It's the same idea that a student could learn about these concepts, stepping through them one at a time and being taught about them.
Thank you, Laird. It's very interesting, really. And you just said us about 8 nomos from Dogon cultures. And I would also like to ask you about Sumerian culture, because I know that there were also 8 Anunnaki, and they were faceless gods, and they were not in general pantheon. So can we assume that this is the same knowledge about the same civilizers?
Yes. The theme of 8 bringers of knowledge is one of Jung's archetypes. This is a theme that repeats itself in culture after culture all around the planet. The idea of 8 ancestors or 8 emperors or 8 wise people or 8 instructors or 8 fish beings, or there are many different permutations of how the 8 present themselves as the bringers of knowledge. And that plays out in Sumerian culture the same way that it does in the other cultures in very similar form. In Egypt, it's the Ennead deities or the Ogdoad deities. In Judaism, it's the patriarchs of the different family lineages in Judaism. The Dogon have similar family lineages based on these same ancestors. The Numo teachers, the form they took, the indications are that the form they took was as small-statured, very sturdy-built people of very odd habits. When in the earliest Scandinavian sagas that mention Orkney Island, the Scandinavians reported finding 2 groups living side by side on Orkney. The first was a group of small-statured people of very odd habits, described in some cases as wizards, cohabiting side by side with average-sized clerics, essentially priests, who always wore white the way the Dogon do. They were described as being so different from the Scandinavians as to represent a different race, which the Dogon would. DNA studies have been conducted on Orkney Island and discovered that it is surprisingly one of the most diverse places genetically on the entire planet. But among those genetics, 1% of all native Orkney men carry the same Y haplogroup that defines the Dogon genetics, that links the Dogon genetics to the Berbers in Northeast Africa, that links them to the Egyptians in Northeast Africa, and that connects back through to groups in the Aegean, including on Crete and places like that. Now, the Sumerian tradition Okay, if we imagine that we're looking at a symbolic tradition that began, I can say the first evidence we have of it following the Ice Age is at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey at around 9000 BC. That tradition influenced the entire local region, the entire Fertile Crescent region, and so it's not surprising that the Sumerians and other groups in that region would retain elements of the same tradition. We see three paths of transmission for the tradition, three primary paths of transmission for the tradition, and these can be followed in any number of different disciplines of science. They can be followed genetically, they can be followed through language studies, they can be followed through the study of agricultural practices, through domesticated animals, through myths and the use of symbols. One path of transmission, okay, first off, it looks as if there were immediate influences on ancient Egypt at 10,000 BC. My friend Robert Bauval is the scientist who noticed that the three large pyramids at Giza reflect the same configuration as the three belt stars of Orion. Now, he noticed the resemblance, but he didn't have an understanding of why someone would do that. The Dogon provide us with a reason why. They're trying to point us to, because the Dogon do the same thing. They place large stones on a plateau to represent stars, including the belt stars. The Dogons say their reason for pointing us to that is to direct us to a structure they call the chariot of Orion. As it turns out, there's a very faint spiraling birthplace of stars called Barnard's Loop that centers on the belt stars of Orion. You can only see it with time-lapse photography. And when you image it with time-lapse photography, it gives the impression of the wheel of a chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in. So the Dogon correctly know that that spiral is there and they know what it looks like. However, the measure of Barnard's Loop in light years is a match for the measures in cubits of the Great Pyramid. They both measure 440 by 280. The Egyptian word for cubit was akumeh, which literally means light measure. And the way we understand the size of an Egyptian cubit is because we inferred the size from the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. So the very dimensions of the Great Pyramid are pointing us directly to Barnard's Loop also. So we know that's a connection. So we have immediate connection with ancient Egypt at 10,000 BC because at least those placements, those alignments must have been done in the era of 10,000 BC. If not, then we have to imagine that at some later era, the Egyptians were capable of retrospectively calculating what the alignment should have been at 10,000 BC, which I don't think is true. So it's likely that we had direct influences on Egypt at 10,000 BC. Beyond that, we have three other paths of transmission that happen. The first one moves southeastward from Göbekli Tepe down into India, and it continues south and east as far as Australia to the Aborigines in Australia. We can see evidence of the tradition. It was carried by a matriarchal group called the Shakti cult, who are still in existence in India. They have a center of worship that is focused in I think the east coast of the peninsula of India, in a place called Orissa. So that's one path of transmission. The primary deities of the Shakti cult are two mother goddesses who are treated as the two mothers of the elephant god Ganesha. They're always pictured with Ganesha. And so we have obvious connections to Hinduism. We have less obvious connections to Samkhya and to Buddhism. All of the traditions in India relate to that one path of transmission, and the symbolism all goes back to Göbekli Tepe. The second path of transmission is southward from the Fertile Crescent region through Palestine to the Canaanite tradition and the early Hebrew tradition into Egypt. By pre-dynastic times, we see those influences in Egypt. The first path I talk about that comes down into India also seems to have continued on to Elephantine in the south of India by around south of Egypt by around 4000 BC. The tradition there is characterized by two mother goddesses and a god of abundance named Hapi, who has a lot of the attributes of Ganesha, and the mother goddesses have the attributes of the Shakti cult goddesses. So it looks like we have Indian influences coming in from the south at 4000 BC at Elephantine. We have Middle Eastern traditions coming, or Near Eastern traditions coming in from the north by around 4000 BC. But we have another path of transmission that seems to have jumped somehow to Orkney Island by 3600 BC, with groups educated on Orkney, who then were, the Dogon say that after the group was educated, they returned back to where they came from and were the bringers of civilizing skills to their own culture. And so it looks as if the ancient Egyptian dynastic tradition was a product of the Orkney Island instruction at around 3000 BC. And there are many reasons to think that that's true. At Abydos in Egypt, we have any number of elements that recreate elements first seen on Orkney Island. We have a cemetery situated in view of two mountains with a gap. That is a recreation of a sighting of the Orkney sites. The name Abydos, according to Om Sete, was originally Abdu, which means the desired mountain. In other words, the name of the place tells us that it was sited because of the mountains. The first burial chambers, the burial chamber of the first pharaoh of Egypt, who is called Narmer, repeats the architecture of all of the original stone houses at the Skara Brae village on Orkney, 600 years earlier or more. So there are many reasons to think that ancient Egypt, dynastic Egypt, was a product of the instruction of the Orkney Island tradition. The Dogon also have many commonalities with Egypt at around 3000 BC. It looks as if certain of the instructor priests continued home with the graduating class of initiates to help establish the tradition in their local domain. So it could be that Dogon priests accompanied the ancient Egyptians and constituted the first priests and the first pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Now, in the same era as dynastic Egypt, at around 3100 BC, we see agriculturally based kingships arise abruptly against the backdrop of no historical development in Egypt, in China, in Ireland, and in South America. In Egypt, the name given to the tradition was Taru. In China, it was Iru. In Ireland, it was Aru. And in South America, it was Peru. Those words in various languages work with the ancient Egyptian language and the Faroese language of Orkney Island. Those words can represent names of the four cardinal points of the planet, north, south, east, and west. They can also represent phonetically four stages of development of agricultural process. The first represents an uncultivated field. The next represents fields with seeds planted. The next represents crops growing in a field, and the last one represents crops stored in a granary. So a book I'm just now finishing traces how the Orkney tradition got from Göbekli Tepe. Researchers on Orkney have not solved that mystery because their approach is to look at one element at a time. And they can see, well, yes, the ancient variety of Orkney sheep originated in the Göbekli Tepe region, in the Fertile Crescent region, but every domesticated sheep originated there, so that doesn't tell us anything. It could have made its way across Europe by any number of pathways, and we have no idea who the people were who brought it. And each of the elements that they look at, they say the same thing with. We say, okay, here's a style of architecture of house. We can't find any local correlation to that architecture. We have no idea who brought it. In every case, when they look at the elements one at a time, it's equivocal as to where the people came from. They might have come from any number of places. My approach instead has been to look at the clusters. We have several different clusters of elements that arrive on Orkney at the same moment. Some of them are architectural, some of them are agricultural, some of them are cosmological, some of them are linguistic, some of them are cultural, some of them are like burial traditions and things like that. These clusters move hand in hand by a particular pathway that we can trace, because we can't positively trace the individual elements, but we can trace the clusters moving together. And there are certain clusters that cannot have reasonably moved one item at a time. Imagine the concept of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost arriving at the Vatican as individual elements. They couldn't have. They had to have arrived as a group. No thinking person believes that those three elements arrived separately and then somehow came back together at the Vatican. Well, we have similar situation with the cosmological elements on Orkney. It's not reasonable that they moved piecemeal. They had to have moved as a cluster. The same group that understood about measuring in cubits understood about the sequence of stages of the creation of matter. This is a body of knowledge. This is a whole philosophy that moves as a unit. It doesn't move item by item. And so to the extent that we can trace these clusters moving together, now we have a positive way to say how the tradition got from Göbekli Tepe to Orkney. And the mere act of tracing how that moved opens up all sorts of new information about all sorts of traditions that we wonder about. We wonder about, I'll try not to pre-announce the details of the book, but questions of linguistics that make no sense whatsoever. Why there is no Indo-European language root for certain words in places like certain cultures that we can see. Oh, say ancient Greece has certain cosmological elements that we recognize, but no one can trace the etymology of the word. Where did the word come from? When you look at it from my perspective, it opens up because the primary influence, the immediate primary influence ends up being from Orkney, not from any other place. And the Orkney site had an ancient language called Faroese, and Faroese ties to all sorts of things, including the Dogon religion. Some of the Dogon words, language are Faroese words. So to get back, that's a long answer about the Sumerians. The Sumerians come out of a similar path of transmission. They didn't have to move very far from Göbekli Tepe. It's the same tradition. We can pretty much guess that anything they have is going to correspond or correlate pretty well to the very early traditions in the Near East. Sorry to be so long.
No, that's terrific answer. Really, thank you very much. Because it's essentially like you're presenting whole concept that it's not just the symbols, it's not just the myths. It is the whole package of knowledge which kind of exist all together, right? It was not any kind of evolution development. It was just a package and in a different area, which was given and transferred to the people. And right. It was moved at the different parts of the earth. It's really amazing knowledge, and it essentially answers a lot of our questions. You bring in so many interesting things and ideas that we are really kind of cannot resist to ask you many other questions, which we were finding that we're preparing for new kaleidoscope of facts. And Alexei wanted to ask you about some Dogon's traditions, possibly related to Egyptians.
Yes, Laird. In Egyptian culture, there are mentions of the Ben stone and of pyramidal shape. And we know from your books that Dogon culture has a stone which they use for rituals. And in your opinion, what is the sacred meaning of this stone?
I had talked about parallelism between structures and parallelism between the way dynamics of energy. Imagine, because of that parallelism, that the effects we see when we observe a black hole are just a macrocosmic repetition of the effects that we would see if we were quantum level sized and could observe the collapse of a wave function to become a particle. From my perspective, that's the same dynamic. That it's the same energetics that cause both to happen. Now, from the Dogon perspective, that shape of the Ben stone, which actually in purest form is a more of a rounded shape than a purely straight pyramid shape, corresponds to what Stephen Hawking would call the event horizon of a black hole. It's the boundary at which light is no longer able to escape the gravitational pull of the black hole. Creates a shape like that. In ancient Egyptian culture, the Ben stone took on significance because of that symbolism, but it also took on added significance because of a choice that the architect of the pyramid made, Imhotep. To understand this, we have to talk about a Dogon shrine called a granary. It's an archaic form of a Buddhist stupa. A Buddhist stupa has a squared base and rises to a rounded top. A Dogon granary has a round base, sits on a round base and rises to a flat square top. From my perspective, the Dogon structure is the original form, the archaic form. But for the Dogon, that structure is strictly symbolic. It's not meant to be built. In fact, the instructions for how to build one include an internal contradiction that prevents it from being built. You can't build it the way they say to build it and have it look the way they want it to look. You can either build the way the structure looks. It looks roughly like a pyramid sitting on a round base with staircases, 10-step staircases up each of the 4 flat sides of the shrine, rising to a flat top that's 8 cubits by 8 cubits. But the way the instructions are, the structure is supposed to have a 10-cubit radius. If you were to build 10 1-cubit steps up the side of a 10-cubit radius, the staircases would meet at a peak at the top, a point like a regular pyramid. But the Dogon say it needs to produce a flat top with a square shape, 8 cubits by 8 cubits. The only way to do that would be to move the staircases away from the base of the shrine, which is not the way the Dogon draw it. When Imhotep was building the Great Pyramid, he had to resolve a dispute between 2 factions of his priests. One faction wanted the pyramid built one way, the other wanted it built another way. And the way Imhotep resolved the dispute was he claimed to have built a flat top pyramid. As a matter of fact, I think there's architectural evidence that it was originally flat topped. But then he said he placed on top of that flat top pyramid a Ben stone, which was an unimpeachable icon of Egyptian culture. No one could complain about placing a Ben stone on top of the shrine that brought it to a peak. Now he'd satisfied both sets of priests. He'd built the flat top structure. He'd also built the pointed structure, and he'd sort of sidestepped this contradiction. There's a reason for the contradiction. Every public statement by any of the classic religions represents that the concepts of energetic creation are fundamentally not knowable. Humanity is not capable of understanding these energetics. My problem was that the more I looked into the Dogon references and did the comparative study to the other cultures, it was looking more and more to me as if these energetics were entirely understandable, that we're resting on a handful of dynamics of energy that once you know what they are completely understandable. So why is it that these cultures say that? Well, the traditions fib occasionally, according to the Dogon. The Dogon have a celebration of Sirius, the star. There are two stars in the Sirius system, one a bright sun-like star and the other a small dwarf star. You can't see the small dwarf star because it sits in the glare of the bright star, but the Dogon know it's there. They know its attributes. They know the correct orbital period for the two stars. The orbital period is 50 years, and the Dogon celebrate they hold a major celebration of the stars of Sirius called the Sigi. Officially, they say they hold it every 60 years. But the French anthropologists say that, in fact, what happens is that after 50 years have passed, the priests find a pretext to make an exception this one time and hold the celebration 10 years early. And so they're actually holding it every 50 years. And your average Dogon tribes person doesn't live long enough to notice the deception. They don't see two celebrations normally. When someone does live long enough to see the second celebration and might figure out that, hey, this is supposed to be every 60 years, not every 50, they co-opt the person. They make a big deal, a big celebration about the fact that this elder has seen his second Sigi celebration, and they celebrate him, and they walk him around and parade him around and give him presents and heap praise on him, and essentially convert him to, make it politically impossible for him to point out the difference. Now, that's one of the sorts of fibs that the tradition tells when it has to. Esoteric Buddhism tells us that the idea that these concepts of energy are unknowable is one of those fibs. That in truth, the energetics are completely knowable, and that when you come to arrive at an understanding of how they work, you'll realize that they're completely knowable. This is not insurmountable knowledge. This is very accessible knowledge. With the Dogon granary and the contradiction in its dimensions, there's a reason for that. Tibetan Buddhism also says that the root nature of energy is fundamentally unknowable. For me, that root dynamic of energy they're talking about is an oscillation called a dipole. We have electric dipoles, we have magnetic dipoles, we have molecular dipoles. It's likely there are even gravitational dipoles. Oscillating energy is the root dynamic of the universe. It's an oscillation of energy that measures out time as it's experienced non-materially, from my point of view. Tibetan Buddhism says that because that oscillation is sometimes inward and sometimes outward, it's the nature of human consciousness not to be able to focus on more than one thing at a time. And so the effect is like an optical illusion. We might be familiar with the famous optical illusion of the faces of the two faces of a person, where the space between the faces defines the shape of a vase, a flower vase. It's the nature of human consciousness that we can't focus on both of those images at the same time. We can look at the faces or we can look at the vase, but we can't have both in focus simultaneously. Human consciousness can't do it. That's what the tradition means when it says that the root state of the energy is fundamentally unknowable. It's that our consciousness can't take it all in one glance. That it's not that we can't understand it, it's that it's fundamentally an optical illusion from our point of view. So again, a long way of answering your question about the Ben stone. The Ben stone represents that dynamic of what happens to light with when a vortex forms that that produces mass and slows time frame.
Yes, thank you very much. This quite interesting, and I hope our viewers also can now have a more whole and quite complex explanation, but they can read more in your books, I guess, so that they can understand in details. And coming back to these teachers who transmitted all this knowledge, obviously the Dogon people could not learn by themselves these things about like the orbits of the planets. Even we cannot see, and as we know, I mean, the Sirius B cannot be seen because Sirius A is like 10 times brighter than our sun, so we cannot even do it until quite recently. And to get back to these teachers, do they come at some specific times or like periods, like cycles, or are there specific stages of our our development as a human race when these teachers are coming to renew the knowledge?
If we understand that the fundamental difference between the two universes is quickness of time frame, when we arrive at the point that we're at right now in the cycle, where our universe is as material as it's ever going to be, and non-materiality is as non-material as it's going to be, time frame is running so ultra quickly for the non-material side that Samkhya says it has perfect knowledge because every event happens at once, effectively, but an inability to act because there is no moment of time in which to take action. Now that circumstance, if we were talking about a human consciousness, we understand that the dynamic between these two universes is essentially the dynamic of consciousness. That we can consider the pairing of the non-material and material universes together as representing a conscious entity. Samkhya does not deify it. Actually, Samkhya expressly treats it as non-deified. Kabbalism refers to it as the primordial individual, not deified. The Dogon understand it as not deified, although later traditions that spawn from Samkhya treat it as a god or treat it as a deity. The root dynamic between those universes is the dynamic of consciousness. Now, if we were talking about the state that the non-material side of the consciousness is in at the moment we speak, it would be equivalent to a human being with a condition called locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is a circumstance where the person's physical body, they are no longer able to move their physical body, but they're still perfectly consciousness inside their brain. Oftentimes it looks as if they're brain dead. There's a famous case in France of a gentleman who suffered a stroke at the wheel of his car, and was taken home. They thought he was brain dead, and they took him home to care for him. He was still able to intermittently blink his eyes, and they thought they were just random flutters of his eyelids. But one of his aides figured out that they weren't random, that he was trying to communicate that he was still conscious inside his head. And so she worked out a system with him. She would step through the alphabet, and he would blink his eyes when he wanted to indicate a letter, and he was able to spell out the words that way and communicate with her. He eventually wrote the entire book. It's called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. He wrote the entire book, one eye blink at a time. In the circumstance of the universes, the less material side, about a third of the way into the process, figures out that the trend is towards locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is like being buried alive. It must be a very horrific state. According to the Yuga cycle, it persists for 4,000 years, during which, unless a person had a compatriot like that aide in France, who knew that the consciousness was still there, who could still communicate with it, who could still take action on its behalf, unless you have that, it's a horrific state for a consciousness to be in. And so the non-material side realizes that at the point where it's going to be locked in, the only possible compatriot, the only possible caretaker it has is the material side. But unfortunately, in that same era, the material side will be so distanced from knowing that it's there that we'll have no understanding that non-materiality is even there. So just at the point it needs us, we're no longer able to tend to it. We're no longer able to be a caretaker for it. And so the non-material side mounts a mission to the material side to establish a structure for society on the material side, whose purpose is to do two things: to preserve knowledge of the fact that the non-material side is there, and to essentially interview and select out a group of sincere initiates who can act as communicators and caretakers and people who can act on behalf of non-materiality while it's in that state. And so it's a mutual concern, more so because the dynamic of the cycle of energy repeats every 26,000 years. Every 26,000 years, or every 13,000 years, the other universe is going to switch places and be in the opposite position, is going to need the same help that the first one needed. So it's a compact between the two universes to be caretakers for each other. So that's the ultimate motive that sits behind this communication non-materially to materially. And your question was, does it happen cyclically? Yes, it does, because 13,000 years from now, well, actually a few thousand years from now, we will be in the circumstance that the non-material side was in during the Göbekli Tepe era. We're going to have a great need to help our material sibling establish a society that helps them remember that we're there. Very simple motive.
So basically what you are saying is that we will transit into the non-material side of things, and from there we will need to come back here and help material side establish right. a structure for society so that they remember that we exist.
Right. And so the idea is to try to do such a good job of establishing these structures that the knowledge persists with at least a small group of people, because that's all the non-material side needs. Samkhya says there are routine attempts made from the non-material side to communicate with the material side, and that those attempts take the form of meaningful synchronicities, vivid dreams, unusual behavior of animals, clairvoyance, divination, and many of the other paranormal effects that we are aware of. It might even extend to what we interpret as UFO contacts, what we interpret as crop circle formations. Routine attempts are being made from the non-material side to communicate with the material side. Now, the circumstance is very similar to if I were to come to Russia and attend a cocktail party, not speaking a word of Russian, and midway through the evening, I learned that there was a person sitting over in the corner who spoke a few words of English. The chances are very good that I would spend the rest of my evening trying to communicate with that person who spoke a little bit of English. That's what happens with non-materiality. When they come to realize that one of us is paying attention and allowing that there might be intelligent conversation attempting to be carried out, we foster it to ourselves because non-materiality is so pleased to have a possible person to communicate with that it only increases, the activity only increases. And the entire nature of the esoteric tradition, the relationship between the student and the informant, follows that dynamic of communication. The student is required to practice and learn and become proficient at inferring what the next piece of it is, taking what they've already known and applying discriminating knowledge to it, and inferring what the next piece of it has to be the next question asked. When the question's asked, non-materiality is required to provide an honest answer, a truthful answer, if the question is appropriate to who we are. I have traveled with, a few years back, I became in name the leader of a bus tour of Orkney Island to some of the major sites, and found myself on a bus filled with people who with various degrees of psychic intuition, psychic healers, and the whole range of connectivity in various ways to things non-material. I ended up accompanying those people to sites that I had already been at before, and when I had my own impression of what the sites were about, what sorts of esoteric things were going on with the sites, and person after person was independently verifying to me without knowledge of what I thought, telling me that they were sensing certain things about the site that they thought were true, that aligned with what I thought were true. But this intuition, there were times when one of the psychic healers would pose a question. Her method is, the way that she interprets information is by posing a question that she then receives an answer to. But it's not certain when you pose a question that you will receive an answer. You might just as well be told, I'm sorry, that's above your pay grade. You don't have the authority to ask that question, that you can't ask that question. So in a couple of instances, I asked her to reframe the question again, only ask it on my behalf, not on her behalf. And when she did that, then she received the answer. There have been other circumstances where I've been involved with people who are much more intimately connected than I am, and the same thing happens. I won't get an answer to a question, but the more intimately connected person will, where they perceive things about a situation that I don't recognize immediately. So it's a very interesting process, but that whole initiate to informant piece of this is symbolic. It's symbolic of the relationship between non-materiality and materiality, how they interface with each other.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think we have another question. If we would say just in a few words, what would be the message from the Dogon people to us?
I had actually framed some ideas in connection with that. I had written a nice statement to encapsulate that, if I can find it here. I'm not coming across it. Essentially, what they would say to us is that our job as material beings, first, their purpose for us as material beings, their goal for us was to help establish a sense in us of our true relationship to the broader processes of creation. Their belief was that if we understood what our real position was in the entire scheme of things, that we would be more likely to make choices, correct choices, to benefit the entire construct, to benefit everyone rather than benefiting just ourselves. So that's one of the first thrusts. A second thrust is to help foster in us the facility for discriminating knowledge, which is the ability to draw inferences from a list of facts. That it's one thing to know A, B, C, D, and E are true, but it's far more powerful to be able to infer from A, B, C, and D that E, F, and G must also be true. And that's a skill that the initiate is being trained in by their informant, by requiring the initiate to develop the next question they're going to ask, to develop their own next question. It requires them to think about what they already know and carry that the next step. And much of this information symbolically is laid out that way, where they've told us there's parallelism between two themes. And they've already told us, well, I'll give you an example. They've said that 4 is the number of the male, numerically. I'm sorry, 3 is the number of the male, 4 is the number of the female, and that 7 is the number of the individual. They've also told us about symbolic reversals that happen in the tradition. So later on, as they're discussing universes, they happen to mention that 4 is the number of the material universe. That makes sense because we experience materiality in terms of 4 dimensions. What they didn't say, and they've told us that what happens energetically with universes is parallel to what happens biologically with people. They tell us, they drop the hint that 4 is the number of the material universe. We need to infer that 3 is the number of the non-material universe, which implies that it's one-dimensional. It sees a perspective that's one-dimensionally smaller or one-dimensionally precedes ours. But we also need to put together the fact that 3 and 4 together is 7, and that constitutes an individual. In other words, they have done everything except flatly say to us, what you're looking at here between the universes is a consciousness, the consciousness of an individual. Ancient Egypt even applies a name to that consciousness. It calls it Sa, according to the way Budge interprets the hieroglyphs in the Egyptian dictionary. It's the name of the body spirit of Orion is what Budge refers to it as, and he interprets it as Sa. But I know, based on Dogon phonetics, that the phonetic that associates with non-materiality is S-I-C, and the phonetic that associates with materiality is R-A, Ra. And so that the proper name for the two universes coming together should combine those. It should be Sirah or Sirah. So that ties into traditions in Islam and other places where the notion of Sirah becomes important. My late friend John Anthony West, the Egyptologist who studied the Sphinx, sent me an email a decade or so ago. He said, Schwaller de Lubitz, who is treated as the first great Egyptian symbolist, modern day Egyptian symbolist, wrote about a concept called the Bridge of Sirah. And this concept represents what it is I'm accomplishing with my research. He said, the that the idea is that when truth is found, it will be found to lie on a razor's edge between two chasms, one that represents science, the other represents superstition. In other words, that for anyone to arrive at truth, no matter whether they approach it from a scientific perspective or from a more symbolic or superstitious perspective, they're going to need to take a step or two outside of their comfort zone in order to arrive at truth. And that concept is referred to as the Bridge of Sirah, S-I-R-A-H. Well, I wrote him back and I thanked him because years earlier, my wife's and my young daughter at that time, her name is Hannah, had drawn a picture. This is before she knew her alphabet or all of her letters. She knew some of her alphabet, but not all of it. She didn't know how to read or write. She drew a picture that was of me and it resembled me. But at the top, she had written some random letters that she said, she insisted were my name. This is your name. And we said, yes, it's my name, even though it was just a bunch of random letters. We liked the picture enough that we framed it. We still have it hung on a wall around the corner from where I'm sitting. The letters she wrote were S-I-R-A-H. And so I scanned the image and sent it back to John and thanked him for resolving an issue for me, because this is one of countless ways that the phonetics of this system keep coming back and pointing at me for reasons I don't understand. Down to the Scarabray village sits on on land that is owned by a gentleman, a titled landowner called the Laird of Scale. So by the time I get to Orkney Island, the phonetic references have come around directly to my actual name. That when studying the system, very often I would say to myself, if it had been me, if I were the one designing this system, I hope I would have thought to include this, this, and this to make it easier for someone to understand it. For example, I was trying to sort out what is the difference in time frame. How much more quickly does time run for entanglement in the domain of entanglement than it does for us? And how much more quickly did time run at the time of the Big Bang than it does for us? I said, if it had been me, I would have left some kind of reference to quantify that. And so working from that assumption, I did some research and I discovered that the ancient Egyptian numerals are a very odd set of numbers. They have a number to represent the concept of 1. They have a number to represent the concept of 10. They have a number to represent the concept of 100, but then it jumps to 10,000 and then it jumps to 1,000,000. I thought, what did the ancient Egyptians have that required them to count to 1,000,000? There couldn't have been very many things. Turns out those numbers align with the various domains of how it appears that time interacts. I've said that the quantum entanglement has already been calculated. They've tested it. They have announced that interactions happen 10,000 times more quickly than they do for us. Somebody took the time and effort, and the symbols they use to represent these numbers correspond to those domains. So sometimes the symbolic system looks so much like my own work that I get confused that it's not. That's sort of where I'm at with it. And I take the approach that from very early on, I understood that there were things going on here that I don't understand. That just falls in the category of these odd things. I could tell from Dogon references at one point, there are Dogon references about the spiral of matter that directly relate to the symbolism of the elephant god Ganesha in Hinduism. I could tell from the Dogon references that there should have been an original concept, not just of the male elephant god Ganesha on the material side, there should have also been a female Ganesha on the non-material side. And so I went and searched for that concept and found that it had existed in India and in China and in places like that. It had been eventually banned from inclusion in a master volume on Buddhism in India at 1100 AD by an emperor, banned from mention in Chinese culture. There's no mention I can find of it, no artistic representation of. The two Ganeshas are, the relationship between the two concepts is the relationship of an embrace. And so I was looking for a male and a female Ganesha in the act of an embrace. And I could see that the concept was mentioned in India, but there was no representation of it. It had only survived in Shingon Buddhism. And eventually my wife, I came across a list of instructions from China that described how to properly create a figure to represent it. If you were going to form it, what material you had to form it out of. It had to be made from brass. It had to be a certain height. It had to include certain features. For example, the left foot of each figure had to be set on top of the right foot of the other figure. So on both sides. One of them had to have a shape like a sun glyph on its forehead. They had to be wearing certain style clothing and so forth. The image was considered so secretive, it could only be housed in portable shrines that could be moved on a moment's notice. So eventually looking online, my wife, Risa, turned up a representation that was built to the correct specifications. She found it on eBay for sale by a site in India for not very much money. And so she ordered it. And the site said allow 6 to 8 weeks for delivery. We thought, well, that's fine. From India to the United States, 6 to 8 weeks is reasonable. 3 days later, we had the figure. Very similar thing happened recently. I came across another figure, a museum class rendition of the same figure expressed a little differently artistically, also for sale for not very much money. And it also arrived very much more quickly than we expected it was going to arrive. But all of these elements that come into play, our house is full of things that icons we would collect long before I understood what the symbolism of the icon was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand what you mean. So if your desire is sincere and you search because you really would like to find the answer, so-called destiny will guide you to the right direction, and you will find all answers that you were seeking to find. And Laird, I would like to express my deep gratitude on behalf of all our viewers and all participants of today's amazing broadcast. And like you said earlier, the knowledge is not a private property. Knowledge belongs to the people. And I would like to thank you for sharing with us your wisdom, this incredible facts, so-called missing puzzles that we were looking for so long. And finally, we were able to put the entire pictures all together. So thank you very much. And we're hope for to continue our collaboration with you and your colleague to present to the people the full picture that are missing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm always happy to research a question or explain a concept if I haven't explained it well. Don't be afraid to email me and ask to pose a question or pose an idea or whatever.
Thank you very much. And dear viewers, I would like to use this opportunity to invite you to the 3rd International Online Live Broadcast Conference, Kaleidoscopes of Fact, on the topic of paleocontact, that will held on October 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So this conference will be simultaneously translated to 10 different languages. Scientists and researchers from the different parts of the world will get together in order to find the answers that the most controversial question: did paleocontact exist, and did this contact ever stop? So we are inviting everybody. You can find more information on ALLATRA TV.
What do we know about the contact of Earthlings with alien races? Is paleocontact a myth or a reality? International Research Project, live broadcast on October 13, 2020. What is paleocontact? The Anunnaki and the Apexians. Who are they, and what role do they play in the history of our planet? Hidden historical facts. What happened 24,000 years ago? Is the Earth indeed the birthplace of the human race? What happened to Mars? Who gave the unique knowledge about the structure of the universe to the African tribe of the Dogon? How will a comprehensive study of paleocontact help preserve our civilization? Evolutionary leap in development of science, the exploration of other planets and galaxies by humankind. Comprehensive development of civilization, a life worthy of a human being. All this is possible if we invite experts and scientists from various fields of science, as well as researchers and bloggers for joint research. Anyone who is interested in this topic, together, we will be able to find answers to these and other questions. It's time to bring the truth back to people. October 13th, 2020, Third International Online Conference Paleocontact. Within the framework of the Global Unique Project, Kaleidoscope of Facts. Initiated by participants of Alatra International Public Movement from the USA.